Now, just to jump into what we're going to be talking about today. So here's a snapshot of our agenda. In the next hour and a half or so, we're going to be sharing more like foundational knowledge on some of the housing trends in Northeast LA, some of the formal processes that shape our housing landscape, and examples of some community-led housing strategies. And we hope to wrap a little bit before the 1:30 mark to leave room for Q&A. So today's workshop is the first of a three-part series to support residents in defining local housing policy, shaping housing solutions, and figuring out different ways to become housing advocates. In addition to today's workshop, we're hosting two other ones, one that's focused on housing solutions that reflect community values, and another that explores ways to be a housing advocate, whether that's directly shaping policy or learning more about like tenants' rights. And we want to just highlight our funders for this workshop series. So that includes the Southern California Association of Governments, LISC LA, Wells Fargo Foundation, and California Community Foundation. So for today's workshop, it's going to involve a bit more information sharing than the next two, which we hope to have more room for dialogue and just community conversation. So just as this one is more of a foundational workshop, yeah, it'll be mainly me and Helen talking, but there will be some chances, some opportunities to engage as well. So if you do have questions throughout the workshop, please leave them in the chat and we'll try to respond either right away or we'll bring them up in the Q&A section at the end. And if we don't get to your question today, we'll be sure to follow up afterwards. And when folks do engage, we do ask that you please just be respectful of others and use I statements. In other words, just speak from your own experience and not on behalf of others. And yeah, those are just some simple ways to engage. Let's get started. So if you can go to the next slide. Okay, so just a bit about LA Moss. We're a community organization based in Elysian Valley, also known as Frogtown. We focus on promoting housing affordability and economic resilience for working class communities of color in Northeast LA. And we believe that this work needs to be driven by our community. So we focus on building community ownership, leadership, and partnering with our neighbors like you. And some of you may be familiar with some of our other initiatives like the Mercadito, which is a weekly food distribution, which actually Estella is one of our like food hub leaders for. So it's great to have you in the space. Great. So just to get us started, we wanted to frame our conversation by collectively defining what equitable housing means to folks. And so just kind of talking about equality versus equity, while equality means that everyone has access to the same exact opportunities or resources, equity acknowledges that we're not all at the same starting point and the resources that we need vary largely because of systemic injustices. So equity involves leveling the playing field so that all of our communities have what we uniquely need to thrive. And so as an organization thinking about equitable housing, LA Moss believes that housing should be accessible, stable, and affordable for working class people of color. But we know that our built environment, which is what our sidewalks or streets look like, where new housing gets built, and who new amenities like parks or green space are for, is often the result of just a few people making decisions on behalf of many. And usually this is without meaningfully including community members in the process. And so for us, equity really means centering the voices of those who have historically been excluded from this decision-making process, and who are also most impacted by city planning decisions and changes to the built environment, including decisions around what the solutions to the housing crisis are. And so, yeah, we wanted to host this workshop series because we believe that community members like yourselves should shape local housing solutions because community members are the experts of their neighborhoods. So now let's get into a snapshot of just housing in Los Angeles and Northeast Los Angeles. So again, feel free to add comments and questions in the chat as we go through this next section. Next slide. So as y'all know, or most of y'all who are folks living in Los Angeles, it's no secret that the city and the county of Los Angeles has struggled to provide housing for all of our residents. And housing in LA is currently very unaffordable for a number of reasons. There's not enough housing available for everyone right now. The rate of new housing that's being built can't keep up with the demand for housing. And even when housing is available or newly built, it might not be affordable or accessible for everyone, as real estate speculation or investment and the increased costs of building housing raises rents and property values. Um, and so in Northeast LA, it's a region where it's known for its single family homes and small multifamily apartment complexes, many of which are currently getting sold all cash, being renovated by investors, and being rented or sold at higher prices. And in Northeast LA, there's like a split of people who own their home and people who are renting. And today, the average cost to purchase a house in Northeast LA is 1 million. And to just put this into context, in 2018, the average income for a family in LA County was around 64,000. And the industry rule of thumb for buying a home is that like your home shouldn't cost more than 3 times your salary. So with a average salary of 64,000, you might be able to afford a home that's $200,000. And so, yeah, clearly the average household income in Northeast LA versus the average buying price is severely out of balance when we take into consideration, yeah, that it's like currently 1 million and probably like well over that, in some neighborhoods as well. And I think part of this is, and I think the impact of this is that we're seeing that homeownership is increasingly unaffordable for working class families who have rented and lived in Northeast LA for generations. Which also means like maybe like some of the younger adults of those families, who are trying to like stay in the neighborhood aren't able to afford to purchase a home. And then in terms of renting, we know that rents are not much cheaper with a lot of new housing developments averaging around 3,000 for like a 2-bedroom unit. Um, and similar, if we're thinking about like what the rule of thumb is for rent, your it's recommended to not spend more than 30% of your income on housing. And if you are spending more than that, you're considered rent burdened, which impacts a lot of other areas of folks' lives. So this means that it might be more difficult to afford things like groceries, bills, car insurance, etc. And currently, for the average the average family looking for housing, um, in Northeast LA, they might be able to afford a $1,600 monthly rent. Um, I'm sorry, and you'll see on the right, this is a map of like units that are available at that rate, which is just a two, I think, currently in the entire Northeast LA. And yeah, one contributing factor of how these conditions have gotten this way is that while housing costs go up, income levels are staying the same. And especially with COVID, and for those now unable to find work or return to work, a lot of renters have accrued rent debt and are facing potential for evictions and just increasingly unstable housing. And so that's just like a high level snapshot, which I'm sure like most of you are familiar with. So we'd like to just share a poll now to ask what housing conditions you're seeing the most in Northeast LA. And I know some folks aren't directly from Northeast LA, so feel free to share what you're seeing in your neighborhood as well, if you're not familiar with our region. Great. So I think folks should be able to see the results, but most folks said the biggest issue is that rents are unaffordable. Also, a lot of new housing development is unaffordable, and rents are rising. So yeah, a lot of barriers for renters right now in Northeast LA. Um, so that's just like a snapshot and some trends that I think you're all familiar with, but now we want to shift into understanding how policy sets the rules for housing, in LA. And so the next few slides are going to be a bit more like technical, but it's important to understand that just understand the big picture of the process and like who the players are, rather than needing to know all of the technical details. And so I'm going to pass it to my colleague, Helen, who will guide us through this section.
So here you have a map of the city of LA, and in the city of LA, there's something called the general plan. And what the general plan is that it's a blueprint for the city. It sets the rules for the future. It also sets policy goals that guide every type of physical development for the city. And throughout California, every city has a general plan. And within the general plan, there are all these elements. Next slide. Elements in the city of Los Angeles fall into 11 categories. They will define where parks go, what the safety look like, how do we make sure we have good air quality. And in each of these 11 elements, a different department in the city of LA is responsible for each. In the city of LA, the housing element is specifically dealing with housing, and the housing element is overseen by the Department of City Planning, whose other responsibility includes reviewing all the projects for housing and commercial space, and they facilitate the approval of any new development to ensure that the future decisions that are made about development are aligned with the general plan and specifically the housing plan. Next slide. And so within the 11 elements that make up the general plan in the city of Los Angeles, the housing plan is currently going through an update. And what the housing element does is that it identifies what Los Angeles housing needs and opportunities are, and what should be our goals and objectives in order to make sure that we meet our housing goal. The state of California requires that every city updates its housing element every 8 years. And the timeline for the city of Los Angeles is that we need to adopt one this year, and it will be in place from 2021 to 2029. The process for updating the housing element is a long process, and the Department of City Planning recently began with trying to understand what are the current housing conditions in our city. They looked at the housing needs of all types of residents, like seniors, people with disabilities, and those experiencing homelessness. And they look at what is actually available now. Is there enough housing for seniors? Are there housing for multi-generational families? The city will also look at what are the obstacles to building new housing and to preserve existing housing. For example, where is the available land to actually build housing? So taking all of this that I just said, the city, after going through a phase of analysis and public feedback, released a draft of the updated housing element, and it has 6 priorities that range from housing stability to anti-displacement issues to housing production, the built environment. And I'm going to pause there because the housing element draft is hundreds of pages, and our team will have a more detailed workshop next month on the details of the housing element and what is being proposed. I also want to note that the local Elysian Valley Riverside Neighborhood Council will be discussing the housing element in their Environment and Land Use Committee on July 28th. So tune in there. And so we just went over what the general plan is for the city of Los Angeles. And within the general plan, there's the housing element. Within the housing element is also 35 community plans. And what you see in this map here are the outlines of the 35 community plans. And those community plans are very specific to neighborhoods. And they sometimes lump a few neighborhoods together because LA has over 100 neighborhoods. And together, these neighborhood specific plans achieve to the best extent they can the city's general plan and housing element goal. Next slide. And you'll see within the boundaries of broadly Northeast LA, we have 2 community plans that really shape the communities that are part of this broad area. There is specifically the Northeast LA Community Plan, and there's also the Silver Lake Echo Park Elysian Valley Community Plan. Within the first one are neighborhoods like Lincoln Heights and Mount Washington and Highland Park. The Silver Lake Echo Park Elysian Valley is obvious. And these 2 community plans haven't been updated for a handful of years, and they're in line and in queue to be updated by city planning in the next couple of years. Next slide. And you'll see here, this is a more detailed map that includes zoning. So zoning are the specific rules that govern each property. And oftentimes if a property owner wants to build something that is not allowed, that zoning, which you see in that key, yellow represents residential, purple is commercial. If a property owner wants to build something that isn't currently allowed by the zone, you can request for your zone to be changed, and that requires a public hearing process, also known as entitlements. But most of what you see in Los Angeles follows existing zoning code. It doesn't go through any public hearing process. It just goes straight to our Los Angeles Building and Safety Department, and those projects are called by right. The city of LA has not updated its zoning code for 100 years, and it's in the process of using a new zoning code. And what you see here is the basics of our zoning code. Know that the city planning department has detailed webinars on this. We just want to share it as a high level. This new zoning code will be adopted and incorporated as our community plans become updated. So right now, most of Northeast LA still abides by a zoning code that may have Q, R1, C3. And in the future, as our community plans become updated, there will be these different terms that dictate both the built environment in each property and the activity that's allowed. And we'll go into more detail on what can be built when we have another workshop focused on the housing element. Next slide. So what I just went over is kind of 4 broad frameworks. There's the general plan. Then within the general plan are 11 elements, of which one is the housing element. How the housing element gets translated is in our community plans, which there are 35. And within each property, there is a zoning code. This is how it might look in reality in our neighborhoods. This is an example of a property many of you might be familiar with, especially if you frequent our Northeast LA Mercadito every Friday. This project went through an entitlement process, which means seeking public approval and feedback and getting permission from the city to build something different. And this was entitled many years ago, and it'll result in about 120 units of housing in a former commercial manufacturing lot, none of which will be required to be rented affordably, but there is a commitment that the commercial space will have some community benefit. And when the property owners purchased this property, it was zoned for industrial use. And so they had to go through a process to change it to allow for residential. We picked this just as one example of many in Northeast LA where developers will have to go through a process to get approval to build something that otherwise would not be allowed. And one thing we want to highlight is that for projects that have to go through a public hearing process and get entitlements, there is a role for residents like all of you. You can provide public comment, you can voice your opinion, neighborhood councils can take a position. And this type of feedback, also happens on other levels, from the community plans to the housing element. So we want to highlight this as an example. And in our third workshop, that will happen next Tuesday, we'll be talking about ways you can be a housing advocate and how you can give public comment, how you can organize with your neighbors, and how you can shape our housing system. So we just went through a lot of kind of big picture, some of these plans and policies that shape our housing environment. So we're gonna share a poll and have you actually share which of these policies do you think is the most important in shaping our housing landscape in Northeast LA. There's a general plan, the housing element, our community plan, the zoning code, all of the above, or something else. So Ronnie, please share the poll. So the majority of you felt that all of these plans and policies are important in shaping our housing landscape, and that is true. And followed by that is our community plans, also true, which will be updated in the years to come. No one put other. So thank you all for indulging in what is a very technical analysis. So what we just went over the last 10 minutes or so were the elements that make up our housing system. And the housing element, which we'll be going into a little bit later, is really a policy document that guides goals related to housing. And they really focus on meeting all the needs of various households, residents, family structures, and people with all range of incomes. But the housing market is what is gets built on properties, and they kind of shape which buildings get purchased and developed and sold. And so the city of LA, they're responsible for creating these plans and these policies. But the housing market is made up of various players that really build the housing that we see. So, what we see here are five broad players that we're going to go into. Um, and these five players, these are just examples. So you get a sense of who builds the housing in our communities. For-profit developers, for example, they tend to be companies that build housing projects that are rented at market rate. Their goal usually is to have a high financial return because they take on the risks of developing and investing in property. There's also nonprofit developers. They do the same thing. They take a risk and they have an investment, but their mission, and they're usually 501c3 organizations that are a nonprofit with a mission orientation, they will often create housing that the private market won't build, like affordable housing, housing for seniors, housing for veterans, housing for the formerly unhoused. There's also corporate landlords. Corporate landlords tend to be bigger, more established, and they sometimes can be hard to track down given the many layers within their structure. And you're often working with a property manager. Similar to a corporate landlord, but on a smaller scale, are small landlords that are family run. Property owners are often rent to family or friends. They are often the source of affordable housing that is naturally occurring on the market, which is different than affordable housing that is rented by nonprofit developers, which have rules that mandate that they are rented affordably. And then there are flippers, and that's a term that many people are familiar with. Flippers tend to be entrepreneurs who raise the money to purchase property. They usually provide some type of renovation, and they resell their property in a short timeline at a higher value. These players that we highlighted are just five examples of many in the housing system that have shaped the various housing properties you see in Northeast LA, but in Los Angeles.
Great, thanks, Helen. So now that we have covered what housing conditions are like in Northeast LA, the plans, policies, and players that create our housing system, we wanted to just end with two examples of community-led housing that we have seen in Northeast LA. And so community-led housing is where the players are groups or individuals that preserve or develop housing based on the community's needs and values. And these groups or individuals are directly from the community. And these examples may also be examples of equitable housing that's defined by local residents. So the first example that we wanted to share is community land trusts, which are nonprofit entities organized for collective caretaking of land and property. They take properties off the market and make them permanently affordable and lease the space as residential space, business space, and sometimes community centers as well. They also organize people to be trustees of the land and treat it as a common shared resource. And also for folks who are stewarding it to be accountable for its use and misuse. And community land trusts are often closely associated to cooperative living, although not all community land trusts have that model, but in general, they value creative, democratic, and convivial forms of collective life. So one local example of a CLT in Northeast LA is the El Sereno Community Land Trust. And the El Sereno CLT was created out of concern of the growing housing crisis here, um, increasing houselessness and overall gentrification that has been taking over Northeast LA residential communities. And so how it formed was residents and community members from the Eastside Cafe and United Caltrans tenants. They saw a need to reclaim and secure land that would intentionally be passed on to the next 7 generations in their community. And today this CLT has a staff of 4, has a board that reflects the local community, and has over a dozen tenant members. It's also one of several land trusts in LA County. Folks might be familiar with the fact that the LA County piloted a community land trust program last year. And so there are land trusts in other neighborhoods, such as Fideicomiso Tierra Libre, which is based in Boyle Heights, Beverly Vermont Community Land Trust, which is more Koreatown, East Hollywood, Liberty CLT, which is more in like South Central LA. So there is a growing movement here in LA to reclaim housing for community members and have it controlled by tenants. And another example that we see often just with our neighbors and community members in Northeast LA is multi-generational housing. And multi-generational households can look a variety of ways, but their basic definition is a household where 3 or more parent-child generations live under one roof. Um, and it's an informal like household arrangement, but I think it's one that's very common for a variety of like cultural and economic reasons. And so families will self-organize into these arrangements and adapt their properties in ways that meet their families and communities' needs. And in Los Angeles, the majority of multi-gen households are Latinx and Asian families, groups who traditionally share a value of filial piety or a familial obligation for adult children to look after aging parents. Similarly, I think related to that value is a sense of collective responsibility for the extended family unit. So this can also include looking after young children in the family as well. And this is something that, yeah, my family has done for all time, and I'm sure a lot of folks are familiar with as well. I think some other trends that have made this a bit more common are demographic trends such as an elder bloom, where there are more folks who are aging and want to stay in their homes. And they may require more caregiving support from their family, or they're living active, healthier, longer lives and can continue to care for their grandkids in the same home. And on the other side of that, there's also like more young adults who are moving back home. They're referred to as the boomerang generation. And oftentimes this may be like a personal or cultural preference, but sometimes it's also because they can't afford increasing rents or property values to live on their own just yet. And another thing that we saw during the pandemic is that, yeah, we saw this household arrangement increase as more households had to merge into multi-generational ones, often out of financial survival and needing to rely on like other incomes in the household. Um, so what happens when housing isn't equitable or community led? So this often means that market forces end up dominating. And so market rate housing becomes the norm. And for many working class families, market rate housing is unaffordable, as y'all know and pointed out in our first poll. And so when neighborhoods change as this kind of market rate housing and luxury housing takes over and caters toward a certain income level or professional class, a lot of longtime renters who have like built these neighborhoods and shaped the cultural richness of this neighborhood end up getting displaced. And that's, yeah. And so today, just to sum up, we covered what equitable housing is, some of the housing conditions we're seeing in LA City and in Northeast LA specifically. And then Helen shared an overview of the housing process and the policy plans and players. And then we shared a couple of examples of community-led housing. If you do have any additional questions or even feedback for us about how this workshop went, feel free to email us at milahousing@mos.la, and Chaz just left that in the chat. And we'll also be sharing the recording of this workshop as well as the slides with everyone who has signed up. And if Ronnie, you can go to the next slide. And as Helen has mentioned, we do want to invite you to our other workshops. So this Thursday, we'll focus on housing solutions that reflect community values and have a lot of space, I think, for participants to define what that looks like for them. And then next Tuesday, we're going to be exploring different ways to advocate for equitable housing. And we will be repeating this workshop series in person starting next week. So starting next Thursday, and then having it again, like I think the following Tuesday and Thursday. If you prefer to join us at our office in Elysian Valley or Frogtown, or if you know others who would like to. And yeah, Chaz shared the link with more information about the workshops. So feel free to sign up for another one or share with your friends and network.